The connections between language and culture are often studied by linguistic anthropologists. In this section, I will present to you the relationship between language and culture, the Sapir-Whorf for the linguistic relativity principle, language death as well as revitalization efforts, which include revitalization of traditional languages, with particular emphasis in Hawaii with Wende Marshall's piece, Remembering Hawaiian, Transforming Shame. Pidgin languages, linguistic ideology, symbolic practices, as well as worldviews. Human language is a biocultural phenomenon. In other words, there are aspects of both biology that form certain things that we can do with our voice, as well as cultural in terms of the meaning of particular phrases, particular expressions. Anthropologists throughout history have had to confront multidimensional understandings of language. They've had to learn unwritten languages without any instruction at all. And anthropologists were at the forefront, along with missionaries, of doing a lot of the first writing systems of indigenous peoples. Anthropologists have been transcribing recordings, requiring the ethnographer to translate speech, oftentimes excluding the context. Again, the difference between the written and the spoken word, as we discussed earlier with oral traditions, oral history. When we talk about language and languages, language broadly defined can be thought about as an abstract element of humankind, whereas languages are individual languages developed by specific groups of people. Languages can be communicated in nonverbal ways, such as Morse code or sign language. To the right, you can see a picture of a number of different speakers speaking in sign language. Depending on the school that people have gone to, anthropologists have looked at what we have right now is American Sign Language. However, earlier forms of sign language, such as sign language in Ireland, had a very different very different signs for the same word and idea between men and women, because men and women went to different schools. We also have other forms of communication. These are the non-linguistic forms of communication. These can include things like body language as well as dress. And there's a lot of embedded assumptions within spoken language. That is, word-for-word translation is not always effective due to similar words having very different meanings. There and there, for example. It's and its. Also, it requires language learners to know how to place a linguistic form in the appropriate context. In thinking about the design features of human languages, Hackett had defined 16 different design features of human language. Important for our consideration are the ideas of openness, which describes the creativity and variety of ways of communicating similar events; displacement, which refers to the human capacity to speak about abstract or non-existent objects of the past or future. In other words, it doesn't have to be right in front of us in order for us to think about it and to speak about it. And then also the arbitrariness of language. That is, sounds and meanings are so open to human creativity that the link between the two is essentially random. In thinking about the relationship between language and culture and how language potentially shapes culture, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis came out. The grammars of different languages can explain the same event in different ways. Therefore, language is able to alter the ways people view the world. This is strong linguistic relativity principle, or linguistic determinism, which states basically that cultural patterns are reflected in grammatical forms. In other words, things like languages which have no gender pronouns treat males and females with no distinction, whereas languages which have gender pronouns note the difference in power and relationship between males and females. As a counter to this, the weak linguistic relativity principle says that language shapes thought and culture, but it does not determine thought and culture. That is, gender pronouns may reinforce a social order that treat men and women as separate and unequal, but they do not create that social order. In thinking about language in a contemporary context, one of the major concerns is with language loss, language death, moribund languages. According to the Ethnologue, there are 6,909 world languages. 4,000 of these are in danger of being lost over the next 100 years. when thinking about language loss, there's a couple different ideas and terminologies. Languages become moribund when children no longer learn them as their mother tongue. And languages become lost when there are no tangible artifacts left behind. There'll be more in this section on language loss, a number of websites and activities for you to think about in the context of language loss. In the context of language loss and language revitalization can fit into an overall revitalization of cultural forms. Wende Marshall discusses this in her piece, Remembering Hawaiian Transforming Shame, where she notes that languages can not only be nearly lost, but also brought back. She notes that in Hawaii, there was a horizontal oppression wherein the previous generation was forced to abandon their language in the school setting. Essentially, this horizontal oppression meant that Native Hawaiian adults were punishing Native Hawaiian children for speaking the language. And so Native Hawaiian language became a source of shame for children, something that was not desirable or rewarded in the school system. And a lot of this has to do with the overall assumptions built, the ideological assumptions built in to the U.S. school system in Hawaii. The first of these is the notion of Protestant theology, or the emphasis on Protestantism as the highest form of religion. The other has to do with the notion of social evolution. We'll talk about this in the methods and approaches section in cultural anthropology, but basically this assumes, in a unilineal context, a continual evolution of society to more complex and superior forms. And also the notion of manifest destiny, that it was the right of the United States to essentially, the destiny of the United States to go from sea to sea, and indeed in the Hawaiian case beyond, to secure a location within the Pacific. These three ideas, these ideological assumptions, work together with one another to produce a discourse which looks at Native Hawaiian language, culture, and identity as looks down upon each of these things, a real infantilizing discourse. That is, it is an inferior form of being in the world, of speaking in the world, of thinking about the world. Along with this, Hawaiians became a landless people, and with this they realized a 75 to 85% decline in population. The history of Hawaiian annexation is a very notable moment in U.S. history, where the Queen was forced to abdicate the throne by the United States Marine Corps and a coalition of U.S. businessmen. Now, in thinking about the history of Hawaii, a lot of scholars represent Hawaii as complacent with U.S. colonial intrusions. But the spirit of resistance in Hawaii really began with the killing of Captain Cook, and Marshall notes that it hasn't really stopped since then. Marshall entered the field with one theoretical frame. She entered with the idea that what was happening with the cultural revitalization movement could really be viewed as an indigenous nationalist movement. That is, the Native Hawaiian individuals in communities, groups, were seeking sovereignty from and to create their own nation apart from the United States. But after her work in Oahu, she saw that what was happening was more of an internal process of decolonization, or rejecting the shame and self-loathing endemic to colonized peoples. In other words, Native Hawaiians came to see value in what they were doing in terms of their language and culture and traditions, rather than accept the Protestant theology, the discourse of social evolution, or the idea of manifest destiny as being part of the United States. Culture revitalization includes not only traditional material goods, but also ways of being in the world, and also the language, the ways of expressing that, expressing these things and communicating these things to one another. There's a resurgence in pride rather than shame. And with this, we see an increase in the number of language programs and Hawaiian language-only schools. And a lot of this was sparked in 1977 and later 1978, when the song was remade and called Hawaii 78, which created reverberations in cultural consciousness throughout Hawaii. There's a link on YouTube video showing Hawaii 78, which you should listen to. In thinking about when people come into contact with one another, one of the things that sometimes results is if you have people with mutually unintelligible languages, they'll develop a reduced language with simplified grammar as well as vocabulary in order to be able to communicate with one another. This is what's known as a pidgin. Pidgins have no native speakers. Often, if they persist over 2 or more generations, they begin to change. The vocabulary and grammar can become more complex. This is when you get the development of creoles, which function just like any other human language. Important to note is the history of pidgins and the formation of pidgins. Many of these came about in the transatlantic slave trade that Sidney Mintz writes about. And basically what's happening here is a number of slaves from different regions of Africa are crammed together on slave ships and figure out ways to communicate basic needs to one another over the course of the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Languages can remain pidgin. They don't necessarily have to convert into Creole. Also, as the case of the transatlantic slave trade demonstrates, the power relations are key in the formation of pidgin. And even within these individuals, you can see certain individuals that might have more of their aspects of their language in it than another. A lot of these developed, of course, under colonial as well as after colonial regimes or post-colonial regimes. When we think about overall language, this notion of language ideology as well comes up. Language ideology is a marker of struggles between social groups with different interests, revealed in what people say and how they say it. Linguistic ideologies connect the linguistic features of a social group with cultural analysis of what these features symbolize. Morgan writes about this with the language ideologies in the sense of indirectness as a key ideological element within African American English, as speakers of this language were living in oppressive conditions which demanded that they follow rules of speech that marked their inferior status. Language and also our ideas about the world are the way that we can think and imagine the world are connected with one another by what we see in the world. In other words, if you draw 2 lines which are parallel with one another starting off, but then increasingly receding into the distance, many of us can recognize this as a train tracks. However, groups of people that are not familiar with train tracks, they would not necessarily be able to see this image in this particular way. They wouldn't be able to distort the image to resemble symbols rather than reality. Also, perception is modified based on people's surroundings. This was discovered by Colin Turnbull in his work amongst the Mbuti of the northeast Congo. The Mbuti live in a dense forest which altered their perception to shorter parameters, such that in larger distances, where Turnbull would bring them out of this dense forest, then they looked off into the distance and they saw larger animals there. They could not conceptualize that this was a larger animal, but instead rather said that looked like an insect. At the same time, when they saw a fishing vessel, they didn't note that it was a fishing vessel, but rather that it looked like a log. Overall, the notions of socialization and culturalization and worldview shape the way that human beings think about the particular environment and how we speak about our particular environmental surroundings. The notion of socialization is the learning process by which individuals develop the skills they need to interact successfully with other members of the social groups to which they belong. Enculturation is the learning process by which individuals come to terms with the ways of thinking and feeling that are considered appropriate in their respective cultures. So again, socialization dealing with developing skills needed to interact successfully, and enculturation with the ways of thinking and feeling. Worldviews encompass pictures of reality created by members of society. Anthropologists further investigate the symbols used to construct worldviews. In thinking about worldview, a lot of this can be bound up with notions of metaphor. Metaphors are a form of thought and language that asserts a meaningful link between 2 expressions from different semantic domains. Figurative language may oftentimes be more effective at illustrating a complex and ambiguous relationship or concept. So we can think about this in the context of the metaphor, the Lord is my shepherd. what are the metaphorical entailments in this particular statement? The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord is male. The Lord is someone who's in charge, who's watching out for the sheep, who's leading the flock. And what does this say about the sheep, who is the my shepherd? The person saying this is needing to be led. Sheep are relatively unintelligent. Sheep will be slaughtered. These are all of the metaphorical entailments in the statement, the Lord is my shepherd. At the same time, we can think about American PMS following Gottlieb as a coded metaphor, which basically means that women, in confronting any sort of issues with the way they behave, it gives them an excuse not to act nice. This is American PMS, which is an excuse for, is seen as an excuse for why women act in a particular way. What's interesting in this is that women are expected to act according to gender roles where they have a lot of deference to males. Symbols are special metonymies, and that is simply something which stands for something else, which express an important domain of experience. Sherry Ortner, in her 1977 work on the theory of symbols, talks about the American flag as a summarizing symbol of American identity and our sense of being American in the sense of Americanness. Worldviews, there are also key metaphors for constructing worldviews, and Horton has examined how humans construct worldview using key metaphors which show order, predictability, and regularity of everyday experience. They can be divided into three main types. First, societal metaphors. This is a worldview metaphor whose model for the world is a social order. Organic metaphors, a worldview metaphor that applies the image of the body to the social structures and institutions. And finally, technological metaphors, such as using mechanical inventions as symbolic representations of worldview. Historically, the goal of socialization and enculturation in Western societies is often for people to become individuals and define themselves as independent. Also, contrary to the aim of socialization, you have working for the well-being of others. So the idea of the self it can be reevaluated. We can rethink how we think about the self. Personality rather than the self to describe a person's perceptions, behavior within the socio-cultural matrix, which includes the individual's class, gender, occupation, amongst other things. More recent anthropology looks at the external forces and power relations, rejecting the notion that the individual self is coherent as well as integrated. So we come to this idea of subjectivity. And the notion of subjectivity is essentially that this interprets individuals both as agents of their own experience and directed by the power positions that impact their experience. Hence, through subjectivity, we see the self we are seeing the self in this way. This recognizes the multiple positions one individual can embody. This acknowledges the overall position in relation to another individual. So this creates a sense of reflexive awareness overall. In review, we've talked about the connections between language as a biocultural phenomenon and culture, and looking at this in the context of the linguistic relativity principle, the strong and the weak linguistic relativity principle. We've noted that many linguistic anthropologists today work along issues of language death as well as language revitalization, using Wende Marshall's piece, Remembering Hawaiian Transforming Shame in Hawaii, as an example. We've looked at the idea of Pidgin languages and Creole languages, the idea of language ideology, and the importance of symbolic practices and worldviews.